So I wanted to share with you an observation, get your thoughts on it. If I turn on a cable news program that's known for its political viewpoints with respect to the Trump indictments, seems that I'm going to get an analysis that the charges are strong, he's guilty, he's going to jail, he can't escape his just punishment. If I flip the dial to the conservative leaning cable news program, weak case, hard to prove. It's a political witch hunt. This is wrong. Other people have done the same things without being charged. Your thoughts on that observation?
I think the integrity of lawyers, many lawyers who comment is questionable. And I
Mhm.
think you raise a great point about this because look, lawyers take partisan sides, right? So a lawyer will take whatever side. Most lawyers, I would probably say 99% of them, will look at the point of view from what angle they're looking at. This is true of lawyers. This is especially true of judges, right? Very few judges go into a proceeding and want to look at this from an objective point of view. The idea of a neutral bench is a problem. And most lawyers are just doing their jobs, right? So when they're out there, they're going to give whatever commentary they're going to give. I always prided myself on looking at something from a balls and strikes point of view. So in during 2018, the Mueller report was going on. I was invited on basically every news network to discuss, the report.
Right.
And my view at the time, which hasn't changed, is that Trump was guilty of obstruction of justice. That the people talk about the Mueller report, and on the right, you have this vindication or this feeling of vindication because they said there was no Russia collusion. Or at least that's how they put it out to the press. And people would say, Mueller could prove collusion. I said that's correct because there's no such word in the United States Code, the penal code called collusion. It's conspiracy. And Mueller admitted that they didn't have enough to charge Donald Trump with a criminal conspiracy or to say or recommend that they or find that he was engaged in a criminal conspiracy or that members of his organization conspired with Russian officials to overturn the election, or they improperly influenced the election. So even though they indicted a dozen or so people tied to various intelligence agencies that were Russian. But the second part of his report, the people on the right, Fox News and those ilk, which I was a pretty frequent commentator on, they didn't want to discuss that part. And that Mueller laid out very clearly about 10 different acts which can be seen or possibly even proven as obstruction. And I went into this. There's this big battle. If you go onto my website or you go onto my YouTube page, there's a big battle between me and Lou Dobbs, and we were going at each other. And he was like saying that, and I basically, debunked everything he had said. And they didn't want to hear that, and that's fine. And I got less calls on Fox, but I give Fox credit because they would actually have a different point of view. CNN, MSNBC show me almost no love. They don't. They really did not want me to be on much because, again, I call it balls and strikes. So the networks that I'm on regularly now are CBS and BBC because they seem to value a certain impartial sort of analysis. And my view of these things is that these indictments, all four of them, have tremendous problems. And I'm saying that as a person who personally is a never Trumper. Okay, I want to get that out there. I'm a never Trumper, and I don't think he should have ever been president. I think there were some things that he did I thought were very good, but he did a lot of things that I think were unpresidential. And that all that being said, these indictments have real problems. And I think that the CNNs and the MSNBCs are all probably, I think CNN is worse. I mean, because they're trying to pretend that they're in the center and they're not. MSNBC, at least you know what you get. You know what you're going to get when you tune into MSNBC, and you know what you're going to get when you tune into Fox. But to Fox's credit, they still have a variety, at least some different opinions on there. You don't see that on CNN and MSNBC.
And don't forget, you're a repeat guest on this show too. So
And I
I'd
appreciate
like
that.
I'd like
I
to
appreciate
welcome
that.
I'd like to welcome Vinoo Varghese back to Amicus Curie. Vinoo is a faculty member at Harvard Law School's Trial Advocacy Workshop. He is a member of the Forbes Business Council and the Entrepreneurs Organization. He has been included on the National Trial Lawyers Top 100 list for 9 consecutive years, named a super lawyer for the past 8 years. Do you wear a red cape with super lawyers? I forget. Anyway, and Martindale Hubbell has rated him AV preeminent for 5 straight years. Earlier in his career, the New York Law Journal recognized him as a rising star. He has been quoted multiple times for his vigorous advocacy of his clients by the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the New York Law Journal. In addition, multiple newspapers have published his op-eds highlighting prosecutorial quandaries in the cases of O.J. Simpson, George Floyd, and the Central Park Karen. In an op-ed published in March of 2020, Varghese challenged then-Governor Cuomo's failure to include criminal defense attorneys as essential workers, and the next day they were. As mentioned, he has been a commentator on various outlets from Fox to CNN and international networks such as the BBC and Sky News Arabia. He is known as one of the nation's foremost white-collar and criminal law experts. He's a graduate of Brooklyn Law School, New York University, and Chaminade High School. He began his career in 2000 as a prosecutor and founded his firm in 2006. Vinoo, welcome back. Thank you very
Thank you.
much for joining us. I'm
You
going to
forgot to
ask.
mention I have a long history with NYCLA. I
That's
was
right. That's right. You do.
2007 to 2011. I think I was the chair of the Solo and Small Firm Practice Committee.
Yeah. I apologize. I forgot about that.
That's all
That's
right. That's all
important.
right. This is family coming back to
It's
family here. So
I'm going to ask you what might sound like an odd question because this is a show sponsored by a bar association. But we have non-lawyers who tune in and we have non-criminal lawyers who tune in. And I think it's important for people to understand, which I think is missing in analysis on some of the cable channels. Let's begin with a really basic premise. What's an indictment? What does it mean that Donald Trump has been indicted in 4 different cases? And we'll get into each individual case afterwards, but I want to lay that groundwork, please, for us.
So an indictment is just a piece of paper. Okay, it's in this case there's 4 pieces of paper.
Right. And there might
2
be a 5th
federal,
one from what we're
2
hearing.
2 state, and what it is that it's a piece of paper that reflects the vote of the grand jury. So the grand jury is a room that's run by the prosecution. It's not an adversarial proceeding. There's no defense lawyer. There's no judge. There's only the prosecutor and a court reporter employed by the prosecutor and 23 random people who live in that county in Atlanta or that county in New York County in Manhattan and in the federal districts in DC that are comprised from people from the surrounding areas that put into that district. And what happens is the prosecutor presents the case in the way he or she wants to present the case and puts it forward, and they will take a vote at the end of the proceedings. And the standard, it's really important to understand, is just, in New York, it's called reasonable cause to believe, or in the federal, it's probable cause to move forward. It's not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's really important. So the standard of proof that a prosecutor has to get to the next level, which just means proceeding further in court, is a very low one. And so for those of us involved in the law, all of us have heard that sandwich. We're taught it in law school. So I always get annoyed when I hear a lawyer on TV saying it, because it's like you learn this in 1L in your first year of law school. But you know it, which is that a prosecutor can indict a ham sandwich.
And the
Right?
author of that quote, Judge Saul Walkler, was a guest on this show recently.
Oh, wow. Retired New York State Court of Appeals judge, right?
Right. So I'm sorry I interrupted you. So please continue on your analysis.
So, I mean, that's basically it. All it does is a piece of paper that's signed by the grand jury for the person who just takes the vote, no particular power to assign to that person. And then it gets filed in court and allows the case to proceed. Okay, so on a felony charge in state court in New York, you can't proceed without that. I mean, there's some other things that you can do, and in federal court, you could proceed by what's called an information, but they weren't going to do that, and they proceeded by grand jury. I think all of them, to be honest with you, the grand jury system is only used by a handful of states and the federal system, and it's a huge waste of money.
Okay.
And it's not an adversarial proceeding. Most states, the overwhelming majority of states, have moved to what's called a probable cause hearing. And that's really a much better way to go. And it would save the taxpayers of each state and the federal, us, a lot of money if they didn't use a grand jury system.
Let's get into these indictments. So the first one that came down was the people of New York versus Trump. I'll give just a basic background, then you will analyze it for us. So this involves an alleged sexual relationship between former President Trump and Stormy Daniels. I believe she was a actress or did some other things in entertainment. And
adult entertainer,
right? And attempts to cover up or conceal this relationship from the public. Now, I'm not even sure if President Trump conceded that he had a relationship with her. That may or may not be relevant here. So that's the premise of what's going on here. It was a hush money deal, and there's an accusation that the Trump organization falsified business records with respect to the payment made to her to keep quiet about this relationship. With that said, talk to us about more in depth here about these allegations and everything in between.
So I think that this is the most problematic of these indictments, and it was the first one.
Right.
And it was done here in New York. Well, I'm right now, just so you know, I'm in Florida. I'm in Hollywood, Florida. That's Miami behind me.
Behind you.
But I live and work in Manhattan, walking distance from the New York County Lawyer's office. And this is I had said this from the beginning when this was even being investigated, leaked out that this was going to happen, that this is a indictment that's, in my view, a purely political prosecution. I think that this is a real problem for both the integrity of the prosecutor's office, of the district attorney's office in Manhattan, and the judicial system in New York State. Because I also will say that I believe that this case is what presents the greatest potential jeopardy to Donald Trump, because there's no doubt if there's a trial before the election, in my view, the Judge Marchand, who, people have come to his defense and things like that, will put Donald Trump in jail. And I think he's the one most likely to do that. I don't know. I can't say anything about the Georgia judge. Apparently, he's only been a judge for like 6 months. He's an ex-ADA, ex-prosecutor. But Judge Marchand, I have no doubt, based on what I understand about him and know about him, and I actually had a case against his wife. His wife works in the Attorney General's office. I have no problem with her. She's fine. And I think he will put Donald Trump in jail. And I think this is the most dubious legal theory that they're proceeding on, because they are saying that he committed some kind of violation, which makes this rise to a felony. But that felony or that underlying crime is potentially a federal crime. And so this statute's never been applied this way. Then they have another problem, which is the statute.
Well, let's go back a little bit. What is the underlying act that President Trump allegedly did that they're saying, is a felony?
Election fraud. I mean, on a federal election, right? So you have a state prosecutor using an underlying crime being potentially a federal crime for which the feds never brought any charges, right? They looked at this, the Southern District of New York looked at this and did not bring any sort of charges. And President Trump was never charged. Michael Cohen pleaded guilty, and he named, without naming Trump in the charges against Michael Cohen, clearly, Donald Trump that he was talking about. So Cohen is the person who's the linchpin of the DA's case. So that statute, that's law has never been applied to an underlying crime, because it is such a stretch to charge Trump under state law for something he wasn't prosecuted under federal law for, which
And
involves a
the
federal
act,
election.
the act was fraud. Was this hush money payment? That's the fraud.
Correct. Correct.
And how is
That
hush money
you're
fraud?
well, in the
Yeah,
sense, the allegation is that he paid her to hire, so it was an illegal, an unlawful, in essence, a campaign contribution or whatever. It was in essence a bribe, a kickback to prevent bad publicity from
for him,
occurring.
for his
For
presidential
him,
campaign.
correct,
Right.
correct.
Okay.
So,
And when was
and
this
that's a
payment
federal.
made?
Um, I'd have to double check, but
Right.
it was before the election.
Okay.
It was before the 2016. I think it was in 2015, because you have the whole background with all this stuff that was potentially coming out, and you know, and the other problem the indictment faces is that by the time they charged Donald Trump here, or I should say, I'm not in Manhattan at the moment, but where I live and work,
Right.
where they charged him in Manhattan, it's after the statute of limitations is run. So I don't have all the filings in that case. The only thing that I'm thinking of is that they are relying on periods during COVID lockdowns where speedy trial was suspended, because that is the only way. You had basically a suspension of speedy trial in New York State for almost 2 years. Well, then you get your tolling, TOLLING, not related to congestion pricing and all that
Right.
kind of toll, right? You're talking about the tolling, which means the temporary stopping of the statute of limitations that was instituted by Governor Cuomo. So Cuomo suspended speedy trial, I believe, unjustly, inappropriately. I mean, it was an absolute sham. People were locked up and people didn't get just. I had clients who couldn't get cases resolved. Now, luckily, they weren't in jail, but their lives were in limbo for nearly 3 years because of
Right.
these tolling. And so they're going to rely on an emergency tolling. Well, see, I think that's problematic. I think that's a huge problem for the district attorney's office, because that was during the time that, you can argue, look, courts weren't functioning and people were scared and everybody was going to die. And therefore, we can hold off on filing a prosecution, right? Well, the problem with that is, okay, why wasn't this case then charged immediately after all those tolling exclusions expired, right? What were you doing, right? You don't get a reset from that period forward, right? So you should have, if you couldn't bring a case to a grand jury, because there was a while the grand jurors weren't operating, but that was only a few months. The grand jury started reoperating in months, I believe at the end of 2020. So here is the problem that they're going to have. They're going to have a tremendous statutory speedy trial problem, right? Because you're relying on something to give you an extra couple of years, but that's not what those exclusions were meant for. They were exclusions meant at the time. Okay, at the time, you can't bring this, and I can understand it to an extent. You can't bring these charges right now because you don't have a functioning grand jury. You are risking everyone's lives, because, COVID's going to get you, So, okay, so then why did you wait another couple years after all the exclusions expired?
So who was the victim of this fraud? Was it the electorate who were denied to know that President Trump had a relationship and may make the decision based upon that? It wasn't Miss Daniels. I mean, she received a lot of money, and it was Michael Cohen who arranged it, right? He was the guy who physically made the payment from, I guess it was the campaign or the Trump organization, to her, and it didn't keep her quiet, by the way, right? Because she did talk, or at least someone else spilled the beans, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. You're asking a great question. And the question is, who is the victim? How is it that the people of the state of New York are victim? Because that's generally what it is, right? So the
Right.
state, people is a most unfortunate euphemism, right? And I used to be a state prosecutor. I came from the state court system. I spent nearly 6 years as a state prosecutor in Brooklyn. And when you realize, you go outside and you realize that no, you're not representing people as prosecutors. Some of them go, I represent the people. No, you don't. It's actually the criminal defense lawyer who represents the people, right? You represent the government. Okay. So the great question, how is the state of New York defrauded by President Trump, or then candidate Trump? Because Trump never had a chance to win New York. So it clearly didn't affect his right to or the election as far as New York State is concerned. So you ask a great question. I don't have an answer to that question.
Okay. Let's move on to the second indictment then, the second case. So this is the United States versus Donald Trump et al., and this concerns the mishandling of classified documents.
Yeah.
We all know the scene, I think, from television. Envelopes that I'll use the word allegedly contain classified documents. And for our listeners, we did a show on classified documents, but not particular to President Trump, just in general and why the government is concerned about them. And there is an allegation that there is an overclassification, that too many documents are called classified when maybe in reality they don't contain what maybe the common person would think is being classified. In any event, I think it's undisputed that he did take documents when he left the White House to his estate down in Florida, Mar-a-Lago, and to his golf course in New Jersey. And the charges summarily, and you will fill in the blanks, are that he mishandled classified documents and that he violated the Espionage Act, which sounds to me as if he was selling state secrets to some adversary of the United States,
Yeah.
which I'm unaware of any concrete evidence of that other than the Russian collusion allegations, which seem to have been debunked, but I'll let others decide that. So I turn to you, Vinoo, and tell us a little bit more about this particular case.
So this case is, and let me say this, anytime anyone is charged with anything, whether it's a misdemeanor or a felony, it's serious. And the problem for Trump is now that he's got 4 of these cases to fight, right? And each individually have their own problems, and I'll talk about what's wrong with this case. What's wrong with this case is that it seems that every president and vice president has done this to some extent, right? Taken documents. That Biden, there were classified documents in Biden's home. There were classified documents in Vice President Pence's home. You have Hillary Clinton and with his personal email server, right? So it depends on what you decide is personal and what's classified. And this. Now, they will say, oh, I'm engaging in whataboutism. First of all, I'm never Trumper, so I never get engaged in whataboutism when it comes to Donald Trump, right? So what I say to those who are on the left or supporters of this indictment, that when they talk about, well, you're just engaging in what about the difference is that those people cooperated. Hillary Clinton, and I brought this up too in one of my shows, Hillary Clinton testified in front of Congress. And everyone else is cooperating, though there's some issues about Biden right now that have just recently been brought up in the press. But let's grant that they all voluntarily cooperated. Sure, that's a problem, that Trump did not help himself. The issue that I thought, and I raised this on CBS News with their lead anchor when I was talking, he didn't like my response, was that this is a wrong time to charge Trump, right? The election is next year. He's the leading Republican candidate for president. There is no way that you cannot say, remember using double negatives, so let me take a step back. You cannot remove the shroud, the cloud of politics from these indictments. Okay, you can't do it. And so the question for the Department of Justice was, can you be seen as legitimate? Okay. We just found out an FBI agent just last week pleaded guilty, and he was one of the bigwigs in the FBI for acting as an agent, as an unregistered agent for a Russian oligarch. All right. This just came out. We know FBI lawyers and an attorney for the FBI was fired and now charged and has become a convicted criminal because he withheld critical information that led to an extension of a warrant during the whole Russia Trump gate, right? So you have an institution, the Department of Justice, which is, I mean, they have legitimate and serious problems with their integrity. And now you charge during a Democrat's presidency, that of President Biden, you have now the Department of Justice, which is under him. Okay, they're part of the executive branch, charging his main political rival with multiple crimes, and while he's a leading candidate in opposition and could very well beat him in the larger election. So to me, this was unnecessary to charge him now. You could have arranged a deal, which is that we will hold off on charging him if you stay the statute of limitations with his lawyers, right? You stay it, we'll see what happens with the election. We're not going to affect the election one way or another. And when he's done as a candidate, President Trump, we will do it. And then also secure from him a thing that he can't pardon himself. I think that's a dubious legal theory myself, but whatever. There's no doubt that at least half the country is going to view this as a partisan move, right? Because particularly you're like, papers, all right, whatever, right? Oh my God, he did this thing. And then the superseding indictment to me is laughable. And I'll tell you why. Because they're saying that he, talked about some documents when he was in New Jersey at his golf resort over there, right? Well, why didn't you charge them with all of that right up front? That means you went ahead and charged Trump when your investigation wasn't completed, right? Against regular defendants running the mill trial, this is what prosecutors do in the federal system, right? It is not this holy hallowed place. About 70% of my work is federal. And when you push cases, you realize that federal prosecutors are not as holy or hallowed, or they're not this wonderful institution. They have more resources than state prosecutors because they can choose what cases they bring. Generally, at least in the southern eastern districts of New York and places like that, there's a handful of places like that. They can pick and choose who they want to prosecute. So generally, you have a case and you have they often will bring an open and shut case, right? And so you're not going to go to trial because the evidence is strong. And in this country, God forbid you exercise your right to go to trial, your constitutional right, you will get punished. And if you take the stand, you'll get punished even more. And if you lose, right? It's a sick system. It really is, right? But how do you divest politics from this prosecution, right? It's very difficult. I mean, this is unheard of, right? And for something that I think is just, it doesn't even seem that serious to me. Now, he may have a technical violation of the law, but the thing that I said this before, what Merrick Garland should have done is say, look, that's what people on the left will say. He didn't cooperate like Biden and Clinton and others. Merrick Garland said, give us this stuff. What he could have said is, look, if you don't give us this stuff by this date, you will force our hand. We'll have to execute a search warrant. Now, technically, you're not supposed to announce a search warrant and when you could do it, and because that defeats the whole premise of surprise. Right. But in this case, you're talking about the former president. People are like, is Trump above the law? Why should he be treated differently? He's the former president. You and I, Dan, are not the former president, right? So there's a respect for the institution. Now, that's the same institution which people will say Trump didn't respect. Well, that doesn't give you a right not to respect it. So if they had only done things in a certain way, I mean, that was an unnecessary spectacle of breaking into Mar-a-Lago, right? And just turn these things over. And if they had done that, probably wouldn't even be in this place.
To what extent does it, under these very statutes that President Trump has been charged under, to what extent does it matter what these documents are? As I mentioned earlier, we did another show where we talked about the need to protect classified information. And there is a theory out there that I'm just repeating, I'm not expressing any opinion on, that the government overclassifies. Too many documents are considered classified. When you look at them, you say, not really. It's one thing to have the plans drawn up to invade a country. It's another, a nice correspondence between world leaders exchanging niceties in a sense of diplomacy. So back to my original question: to what extent does it matter, if it does, what's inside these documents, or does the mere fact that they are classified and President Trump had them, and to some extent seemingly had them in areas of his home that were not secure, problematic for him?
I mean, it is problematic for him, right? Because I think in this case, you have a technical violation of the law. But I mean, if I were his attorneys, I would be promoting that theory because to me, that seems to make a lot of sense, right? And I think there's too much regard or too much deference to the laws of this country where something is, oh, he committed this violation. So, well, what was his intent, right? What was his intent? That matters and it should matter. And it's very interesting that you have, and this is where I have a problem with a lot of Democratic lawmakers. They're trying to undo the intent requirements of federal crimes. And so, and this is the same way, in the Title IX world, there where they have no due process on college campuses. They want to say that, the intent doesn't matter. And so you're going to railroad kids and destroy their futures in Title IX. That's just an extension of what's going on in Congress by the push by many on the left to undo the intent requirements in financial and white collar crimes. But so the question is, what was his intent? And so I think that it's going to be important, and that'll be a part of his defense, and we'll see what the judge does.
And under the Espionage Act, as I mentioned earlier, being a layman, so to speak, at least in this area, if someone violated the Espionage Act, it sounds like you've committed treason. It sounds, there's evidence that you've done something to harm the United States, to harm the United States government in favor of an adversary. What is the specific allegation against President Trump there, and what is the evidence that he may have done something, again, to harm the interests of the United States?
Well, it has to do with him talking about the contents or something, and he bragged about how he knew, and he had this paper in his hand that he knew that something to do with the Iranians, and the problem is that you're dealing with Trump, the biggest mouth on the planet, right? A guy who just talks. Am I allowed to say certain words on this podcast? Let's say he talks out of a certain portion of his body where the sun doesn't shine. That's what he does, right? So, okay, so being somebody who's uncouth, somebody who is just who he is, does that make it a criminal act? And I think that that's a stretch. And I think, listen, people, on the right-wing news channels, they talk often. And I've been on those, right? So I've been on those. I've been on MSNBC. Right. I've been on all these things. And they talk about Trump fatigue syndrome, right? That the left has. And you got to remember, I mean, it turns out they've been proven right. And I went on every thing, but I argued from what ultimately came of the Mueller report. And now you can see that debate between Lou Dobbs and me. But I think the country and people are going to suffer from TIFs, Trump indictment fatigue syndrome, right? And you just keep charging this guy. I mean, it's just even. I mean, so many people I know in Manhattan, the left, the most left wing place. The thing they start shaking this head. Even they were like, really, Stormy Daniels? That's the first thing that you get charged. You charge him with, right? That was like, it made many on the left even shake their heads, right? And so I think you have a big problem with this case, both factually and legally. But here again, you get charged, it's a problem. And if you're the ordinary man, in this society, charged with the crime, and I say man because it's normally men who get charged with crimes, 99% of people don't have the resources to fight a case like this. He does, or maybe he's raising money and using campaign funds. Who knows? I didn't say it, right? Somebody may have said it, right?
Some
And
have
somebody
said
asked me,
that. Some have said that.
some asked me about the propriety of that. I said, you know what? I have no one's asked me yet officially. When I have an opportunity to look at it, I'll take a look at it and comment on it. But what I'm saying is that that's a lot of energy that's going to be taken away from campaigning and running, and clearly is going to interfere with an election one way or another. I mean, just as news media sources, I mean, suppressed, and you cannot deny the validity of this. As it turned out, social media suppressed the Hunter Biden laptop case right before the election, the stuff that had come out from that, which we now know has led to him being charged, right? I mean, so and the judge rejected the deal because it was too much of a sweetheart deal, right? And it really, shows you that there is obviously a greater bias against Trump than there is for him. And so, it's really concerning to me when you hear that the White House directed social media companies. I'm not speaking about Hunter Biden, but the Biden White House has told social media companies to stamp out misinformation regarding COVID that now has turned out to be the case, right? It's no longer the pandemic of the unvaccinated. It's the pandemic of the vaccinated, as both the Washington Post and the New York Times have reported, right? And, things that have become, where they social media companies at the direction of the government, right? And there was a federal injunction placed upon the Biden administration just over a month ago from doing this to social media companies. So, we have a lot of problems in this country. And I think that this was the wrong time to charge Trump in any way, in any matter whatsoever. Let the electorates, stamp him out. I mean, he lost, right? And he lost by a lot. And so I think he's a nut for the way that he tried to challenge the election. But was it criminal? I know you're going to ask me about that, so I may be getting ahead of myself. So
Well,
we can go there when you want.
That's a nice segue. But before we get into the third indictment, I want final question on the second indictment. So as you pointed out, President Trump's supporters and those who we'll call right wing will point out that other.
That's actually, let me clarify that.
Sure.
You don't have to be a right winger to support Trump.
That's right.
I know many Democrats. Right. I know many middle, moderate of the road people who voted for him because they wanted change in the Supreme Court, and they wanted a change from policies in the Obama administration that they disagreed with, and a lot of them are centrist, and a lot of them were independent, and so I loosely use the term right wing.
So I'll rephrase my question. Those who support President Trump, in particular with regard to the second indictment with the mishandling of classified information, as you said, we've both said, there have been other cases where other government officials, Hillary Clinton and her infamous email server, President Biden and documents in his garage near his car, and they said, look, they did them. Why are you going after him? And I'm not going to get into two wrongs don't make a right, because that sounds like I'm in second grade when I'm saying that. But going back to a question I asked you about President Trump's documents, in those cases, do we know what President Biden had in his garage? Do we know what was on Hillary Clinton's server, other than the fact I think it was her server when she was Secretary of State that she put to her house so she can work from her house, whatever it was? Just curious, do we know anything about these other cases or what those documents were that these other folks took?
So there's been some information released about that, and I think that's with the superseding indictment that talked about the Iranian buildup or something to do with the Iranians. More of that comes out in discovery, right?
Right.
And so but then we may not know, because if it's still classified, we're
They'll
not
seal
going
it.
to know.
They'll seal it.
They're
Right.
not going to know. And in criminal cases, particularly federal criminal cases with large amounts of documents, is always a protective order. So the defense is not allowed to share that with the public. And you know that Trump wants to get this out and argue this in not only in court, but in the court of public opinion, which is his right, by the way. You got to understand that. Any gag order on him is inherently suspect, because the United States Supreme Court, about 30 to 40 years ago, upheld a criminal defendant's right to argue in the court of public opinion, not just inside court. And that was a case called Gentile, the state of Nevada, the State Bar of Nevada versus Gentile. Gentile was a lawyer who had argued that his client was innocent, and he took to the thing. It was like a political corruption case out of Nevada, and the state bar sanctioned him for doing that. And he took that case all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court found that an attorney has not only a duty to defend a client in court, but in the court of public opinion. So during the times that I was on TV back in 2017 and 2018, and people were getting mad at Rudy Giuliani for everything he was saying, I was like, look, he's Trump's lawyer. He has a right to defend his client in the court of public opinion. You may not like what he says, but he has a right to say it, and you shouldn't be sanctioning him for the things that he says. So I don't know if that's a segue to the next
Yeah.
one. You can
Well,
go.
yeah. Let's in the interest of time, maybe we move on. So the third indictment sort of goes, and the third and fourth indictments actually are connected to both to the allegation that President Trump and his supporters made, and that there was some fraud in the 2020 election that resulted in, I guess, speaking sort of simply, that President Biden received more votes than he actually did, and therefore won. So the third indictment is U.S. versus Donald Trump, related to the January 6th riots in particular. And again, the background allegations: there were irregularities, fraudulent mail-in votes. There was the allegation that these machines that were the subject of a lawsuit with Fox News, that somehow they magically changed votes from President Trump to then Vice President Biden, although I don't believe there's any evidence whatsoever to that.
Correct.
And right, and then there was the sort of this
And that's why
desire,
Fox News paid out $750
a
million.
lot of money, right?
Yeah.
Then there was this issue of counting fake electors during the electoral college vote to sort of switch from, I guess they would vote for Biden, but to vote for Trump. And here the charge is a conspiracy to defraud the United States. Talk to us about this one.
So look, I remember watching television on January 6th, and never have I been angrier. I wasn't born in America. I came here as a baby. I got my citizenship because I wanted to vote, because I had to, at the time. Now you can do it, but at the time you had to give up your foreign passport. It's not allowed dual citizenship. And I was like, I'm an American. I'm going to give up my Indian passport. And I never regretted, never looked back. And when I saw people storming the Capitol, I said to myself, why are there not more police shooting these people down? Because that's not a peaceful protest. And I had no problem with Ashley Babbitt getting shot, and anyone else, that's my view on all of this. And I said to myself, that F something, who is in office, right, riling these people on, should never have been in office. Okay. And that's the view, because I feel blessed to be an American. I love being an American. And I think that Trump is a worst example of that. of what's wrong, many things that are wrong in America. But I've since seen, 2 years of Biden, and I think he's terrible. These are my political views, right? But I'm not saying Biden's a criminal. And as bad as Trump was, you had a proper remedy for dealing with him, which was impeachment. And Mueller, a lot of left-wing Democrat people were mad at Mueller, and I'm going to explain why this ties into the whole January 6th thing.
Okay.
Because they were like, he punted. He didn't charge, Trump, even though you had all this obstruction. Well, Mueller said that there is a proper remedy because he's precluded from charging a sitting president for DOJ guidelines. There's a proper remedy for it, which was impeachment. But guess what? The Democrats never impeached Donald Trump on the results of the Mueller investigation. Okay, they impeached him for this the Ukraine issue, and then they impeached him for the January 6th things, and twice they couldn't secure a conviction. So you have a problem now criminalizing what is arguably a person's right to challenge. So he took legal remedies, and he did what he did, and he put for may have been improper pressure on people like Pence, who
Right.
testified against him in the grand jury. Clearly, there was a day it was reported Pence went in and testified for 7 hours. But I think you have a problem with somebody who is, and the indictment, if you read it, starts off that way. It talks about he had a right to even make false accusations. Well, then you're setting yourself up, right, for failure, because that's a soundbite that can be used by his side.
Now you
And
talked
so,
about
yeah, go ahead.
you saw the storming of the Capitol, as this has been called, live. I think you said live.
Yeah,
And President Trump's supporters will say he told people to protest peacefully, and they will point to, I believe they point to some tweets of his where he said, sort of, do it peacefully. So if he's telling people to do it peacefully, if that's accurate, and they're not doing it peacefully, how is he liable?
agreed. I mean, look, but there's also stuff that goes the other way, right? There's this thing, let's take this back, and you can interpret that what we want, and challenging the courage of Mike Pence and all this stuff. So look, there's stuff there that you can interpret, in the opposite way, or the way that it's been interpreted by Jack Smith, right? The special counsel of the DOJ. But I think you have a case that's a real problem, because it has to do again with intent, which I was
Right.
speaking about earlier. What was it Trump's intent? Did he have criminal intent, or was he just somebody who wanted to keep himself in power, and he was using every method for which he could do so?
And I imagine
And
there
I
also
think
is
that's a problem.
there also could be a question. I'm no apologist here. My job is just to ask you questions. But I imagine he may have been convinced that he really won the election, that there were,
Sure.
again, the tampering and the mail-in and all that sort of stuff. So if he's sitting there thinking, how do you prove intent if he's going to tell you, I really thought I won the election? I think he still thinks that in some of the things that I've heard. So that seems to be another problem. So how important is intent in this case?
It's the crux of the case. How are they going to show his intent? So, and what prosecutors often rely on, and they'll say, is that, and I did too when I was a prosecutor. I was like, look, we don't have a brain reader that shows what is in. So you infer, intent by his actions, right? So that's what they will say, and they'll say that, look, this was the election clearly wasn't fraudulent. Well, how far are you going to do to prove that, right? And even if you think it, I mean, this is his brain. If he interpreted it as, I'm being defrauded, and that seems very consistent with Trump's character, right? And I was shaking my head during all these legal challenges, because he lost all of them. The only one that he sort of won, and I put quotes around one, was because that was only to allow certain inspectors in Philadelphia to move a little closer, right? So, I looked at all these things, and his appointed judges ruled against him, right? Including intermediate appellate court judges, and the U.S. Supreme Court rejected his challenge, like unanimously. So, or maybe Clarence Thomas, might have had a dissent. I don't remember exactly, but my point is he lost all of them, and so that's part of the argument that the prosecution will make. But the other part of the argument is, hey, like, why this? Why now? You have a real problem, and you have what's been proven is that the DOJ is not an organization that is. DOJ is an organization that suffers from integrity problems. That's been proven in the last couple of years. Okay, I've seen it in my own practice with certain cases, and I had a prosecutor in a case here in the Southern District of New York who said that a guy was coming forward on his own, cooperating on his own, and all this stuff, and he was under no agreement. And then we unsealed documents in another district, and shows that he was required to cooperate from his original deal. Well, let's say something's going to come from that, and certain heads may roll in the Southern District of New York. So you have a problem. Listen, charge Trump when he's done, when he loses the election, or when he completes his second term as president, right? And you get some people say, it's too late, and you got to stop him from running. Let the electorate decide. That's what Mueller said, and Mueller was correct.
So I want to focus a little bit on the aspect of this case that deals with the fake electors for the Electoral College vote. So I believe, and you will correct me if I'm wrong, that the Electoral College meets to certify the election, and the voters are supposed to vote as their state voted. So New York voted for Joe Biden, the New York delegates vote for Joe Biden, et cetera. Trump didn't want that, right? He wanted he either wanted Pence to sort of not certify it, or have these people woven in there, and instead of voting for Biden, they're going to vote for Trump. I seem to remember similar situations in presidential elections past. 2000, the Gore v. Bush.
I was in law school then.
Gore wins the popular vote. Bush wins the Electoral College by a razor-thin margin because of the disputed election in Florida. And there were people who wanted the same thing. Gore, vote for Gore, not Bush. 2004, I don't know what the basis was, but it was similar. It was the Bush versus Kerry. 2016, Hillary Clinton wins the popular vote. Trump unexpectedly wins the election, wins the electoral vote. And there are a number of...
And Hillary said the election was stolen from her.
And a lot of people sort of said that. So I'm trying to reconcile, just with respect to that Electoral College vote, sort of Trump's charge with these other folks who I think said the same thing. Maybe Trump was more egregious. I don't know. Explain that to us.
Yeah. Oh, so I have to correct something. When Bush v. Gore came out in 2000, I was just started as a prosecutor in the Brooklyn DA's office in November, the fall of 2000. I remember the vigorous debates we had. We printed out the decision, and we were arguing it, and I was like, I will say at the time, I was very upset that the Supreme Court stopped the recount in Florida, and this thing. I think you raise a terrific point, and I think all of that is relevant. They will say, well, what somebody did or didn't do in another case, you technically, the way the law works, the way the system is, you're routinely precluded from making an argument. Well, this person said this and didn't get charged, and this person said this and get charged. This raises the larger issue, though, of the legitimacy of this prosecution while he's running for president again, right? If you waited till he was done, let's see what happened after the election. If he doesn't win, go for it. Get rid of him, right? Let him be done. Or if he wins, and then you just wait another 5 years. As I said, you get the waiver from his lawyers. His lawyers are going to give you that. They would have given him that, right? A waiver of the tolling again, not congestion pricing tolling, but the tolling of the statute of limitations so that you can wait. So that's why nothing interferes with the election, because you cannot look at this case or any of these cases and say there's nothing political about them. And you've raised a great point. So that point that you raised, they may get precluded from arguing in court that point, but that doesn't preclude them from making that point in the court of public opinion, which matters. And they could raise that point and beat that drum till there's no end.
Yeah. So the last, at least for now, the last indictment that I hear there might be more, but we won't get into that, is the state of Georgia versus Donald Trump and all. And this is a case where not only President Trump has been indicted, but Rudy Giuliani and President Trump's former chief of staff, Mark Meadows, as well as others. And the allegation here is leading a criminal racketeering enterprise in which the defendants, quote unquote, knowingly and willfully joined the conspiracy to unlawfully change the outcome of the 2020 presidential election in Georgia. And I believe that the genesis of this is a phone call, I believe it's indisputed, that President Trump called, it may have been the governor of Georgia, and he had a sort of, as you pointed out earlier, his way of speaking, find me 11,000 votes, which I think would have put him over the edge of Joe Biden and therefore capturing the state of Georgia. Talk to us a little bit about this and about particularly racketeering, a RICO statute, because that's the first time we're seeing this in any of these indictments.
So let me say a couple of things. First, I saw Rudy Giuliani in person the day after the third indictment, the second federal indictment came out. And that's because I was filming a show, or I was a guest on a show called Wise Guys, which is like this heavily Italian American. I guess they think I look Italian, so they asked me to come on, and
they couldn't tell by your
Vino,
name that you're not.
They're like Vinoo Varghese, he's one of us, and so I'm on the show Wise Guys with all these Italian lawyers and the host, and it's funny. And Giuliani came in, and it was the day after, and I saw him, and I met him. Now I already know him because I was interviewed by him on his radio show the very day that he got his law license suspended by the District of Columbia. This was back in the fall of 21, if I recall correctly. So, I saw him. I wasn't on the segment with him. I had done a segment and that was done. That was taped. That was a tape segment. And then, I said hello and I shook his hand, and he was coming. Like, I heard him talking about it. He goes, "Oh, I guess I'm co-conspirator one in the third indictment." So this was before the fourth one came out, before the Georgia state charges. And, that phone call that you just asked about, everyone on the, with a certain political thing against Trump will look at that and go, "Oh, that's a smoking gun." It's not a smoking gun. That's just Trump being Trump, right? It's no different than Al Gore seeking to find or count hanging chads in 2000 and all this stuff, or trying to correct those. There's no difference. And so just because he said find me because he didn't believe that he had lost, how would he think that he's going to lose a southern state, right? So
Georgia, I think, is historically a red state, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. So I think that's the thing. I don't think that's a smoking gun, but I think they think it's a smoking gun, and I think I'm having a field day with that, and I'm just saying, what I need to say in defense of that. And I think that the problem, here's the RICO thing, and I think RICO is one of the greatest abuses of prosecutors. It is a tool, a weapon that should not be used. Okay. And people talk about, oh, it's the end of, it helped bring down organized crime and prosecution. And now it's been used in many ways that are completely improper. And I think that this case, if he's convicted on it, and I think there's a chance he might be. I think the case that he's most likely going to be convicted on is Manhattan, right? I think the other cases, I think he's got an equal chance to get acquittals on all three, both federal indictments and in the Georgia case. The Manhattan case, there's no way Donald Trump gets a fair trial in the island of Manhattan, right? And so he's going to get convicted, and I think that judge will put him in jail. So it's their interest to wait till after the election to try to push that off. But in regards to this case, Rico basically says, that, hey, Dan, you and I spoke, and we must be part of some greater thing, and not everybody needs to know. It's the same problem. It's just an extension of an already the first greatest weapon of a prosecutor, which is, or the strongest weapon of a prosecutor, the most lethal weapon, which is the conspiracy charge. Basically, everyone and his mother, you and I we're co-conspirators in something, Dan, right? Doesn't matter what it is. We just saw if prosecutors want to charge us, they will. These are, I believe, wildly unconstitutional, un-American statutes, and RICO is just a further extension of it. And I think that there is caution, and this Georgia prosecutor obviously has ambitions, and so does Alvin Bragg here in Manhattan, right? My home turf. And they're going to use this to catapult their careers to something else. So RICO just makes non-criminal acts criminal, and as is conspiracy, and he's. But I think he's, look. You're over there. I think he may be able to beat that one, even in a Georgia, Atlanta courthouse.
So my last question to you was going to be what you thought the outcomes would be, but I think you've addressed that. So
Yeah, he's going down
yeah,
in Manhattan. There's no
yeah.
doubt, and he'll get relief, but it'll have to be on appeal. He could be sitting in Rikers Island and then in an upstate prison while he waits for his appeal to be heard. That's the part that I think his lawyers. I mean, he's got New York counsel on this case, and they're good lawyers. I know them, so they have to have advised him of this possibility.
So Vinoo Varghese, thank you so much for joining us, and to our listeners, for clarity, the views expressed today were those of Vinoo's, his legal analysis and thoughts, not that of the association. And we welcome all guests to come on to share their thoughts about the various topics that we address on this show. So thank you again, Vinoo, for joining us. Thank you to our listeners for tuning in. I am Dan Wig, your host, and that is a wrap.